We'll be in Luke chapter 15 today, and it's going to be one of maybe my favorite passage. Or at least one of my favorite, for sure. But it's also one I think that's misunderstood and misapplied by a lot of people, especially the last part of it. Should be one that most of us have heard before. We could all tell about the basic information from it. You've got a man who had a bunch of sheep, who lost one, who finds it and then celebrates with his neighbors that he found it. And then you have a woman who lost a coin, and then she found it and she celebrated with her neighbors when she found it. And there's a boy who takes his inheritance, or a man who takes his inheritance and goes to a far-off land, eventually spends all of his money and gets into a pretty destitute situation and decides to come home, and the father welcomes him, and they celebrate with their neighbors. But some of the details that we don't remember, I think, can be the most important for this passage. I want to start out in the beginning of chapter 15. It says, "All the tax collectors and sinners were approaching to listen to him, and the Pharisees and scribes were complaining, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" So these leaders of the synagogue, these people who had studied the Old Testament so much and had memorized and had taught for years with authority to all the people, they accused Jesus, they complained that he was welcoming and eating with sinners. Can you imagine church people doing that? Not at all, right? Nobody would ever accuse anybody else of hanging out with sinners too much. These sinners and tax collectors would have been considered traitors back then. They were people who were collecting taxes from the Jewish people to give to the occupying Roman government. Not only that, they were cheaters. They didn't really get a set pay scale from the Roman government. If the Roman government decided they needed $1,000 from this particular town, and the tax collector could figure out a way to get $2,000, then he just made himself a $1,000 profit. And there wasn't really anything for the people to do about it. So nobody really liked these tax collectors. And we know that from when Zacchaeus became a disciple. We know that when Matthew became a disciple. And sinners, these were not just the way that we all sin. I think we all agree that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But these would have been the notorious sinners, the ones who are known around town as sinning, the ones that people would avoid. Later we see sinners that, I think it was Mary who anointed Jesus' feet, was called a sinner. And it's just a kind of a special title, a special negative title that they would give to people who were known for that sin. And Jesus would hang out with them, and he would eat with them. Eating with them was a lot more of a big deal to them as it is. Wow. Sorry, terrible grammar. It's a much bigger deal for them than for us today. Today, and especially maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, a handshake meant a lot to people. That was how you sealed a deal before there were real contracts. That's the way you greeted someone in fellowship. But in that culture, it was eating together. So by eating with them, Jesus was saying they were okay, saying that they were welcome, saying that they were worth his time. But the disciple or the Pharisees, they didn't like that. They didn't like how much time that Jesus spent with them. But eventually Jesus would say to them, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Jesus came to save that which was lost. So he spent a lot of time with people that the Pharisees didn't spend very much time with. People who would have been considered unclean, people who would have been rejected by the crowds and the people in the synagogue, people who were ignored. But Jesus was the one who spent his time with them and welcomed them and greeted them. And that's who Jesus is talking about here, or talking talking to here, I think, because I don't think the Pharisees were listening to him very much. So I think Jesus did a lot more of his teaching to people like the disciples, ones who had come from the trades, people who weren't really well versed probably in the Old Testament, people who didn't really grow up being welcome by the church or the synagogue folk. But Jesus was there for them. And he was there for us. He is here for us who are far away from him. He says to them, What man among you who has 100 sheep and loses one of them doesn't leave the 99 in an open field and go after the lost one until he finds it? I think that's something these guys could relate to. Shepherding was a relatively common occupation back then, even though they weren't highly respected. They were the kind of people who smelled like sheep all the time. They worked strange hours. They would go out and they're basically working what would amount to 24-hour days, sleeping out with the sheep, wandering them to green pasture. And if you've ever read Psalm 23, it talks about how God is like our shepherd. And it describes the way that sheep operated back then. And it was the shepherd who would help them to find the water and the green grass and take care of them and protect them, lead them, and clean them, get the briars out of their wool. All of these things maybe we don't think about, all the work that these shepherds would have gone through. But it wasn't just like a business to them. This shepherd, this hypothetical shepherd, has 100 sheep and one wanders off. But he still takes the time to go and to find the lost sheep. He still makes an effort to go and to find that one, even though there's 99 others. He didn't just let that one go away and stay away. A lot of times when church people read this passage, they think about some of the ministries of the church over the years. Things that they've wanted to do because they knew and they hoped that it could bring in one person. They hoped that even one person might be saved because of this thing that they were doing, whether it's a food pantry or whether it's a VBS or whether it's Sunday school or who knows what. They're hoping that one person would be saved through this. And later in this passage it says, I tell you, in the same way there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous who don't need repentance. And I think it's a good attitude to have, to think about that one, to think about the person who really needs a shepherd, the person who's going to wander off, the one who is disconnected from the body or from the fellowship. That's the kind of person that Jesus wants us to seek out. And he lets us know that these 99 are going to be safe. They're going to be okay. They're all together. They are supporting one another and protecting one another, but that sheep who is alone has none of that. That sheep who is alone needs the shepherd to go out and to find the sheep. But this sheep means so much to this shepherd that he gathers up his friends and his neighbors to celebrate when he found the sheep. And I think, I can't prove this, but I think that means the sheep was lost for a while. Because it doesn't make a lot of sense to call up your friends and neighbors and say, hey, I just found that sheep that I lost, if you didn't tell them in the first place that it was lost. I think the shepherd put forth a lot of effort to find this sheep and eventually told people, have you seen my sheep? And then went on to describe how it looked exactly like all the other sheep. But I think that's what he did. I think he spent a lot of time trying to find this sheep. And eventually he finds it, and they celebrate together because it's a big deal when one who is lost becomes found. And that's one reason why we celebrate so much when someone comes to faith for the first time. And then he moves on to, one of the things I like about Jesus is using analogies that people can relate to. And I think he gave us one story particularly addressed to the men and one story particularly addressed to the women. And in this case, the woman has 10 silver coins and she loses one, does she not light a lamp and sweep the house and search carefully until she finds it? Have any of you lost a coin and spent enough time to clean the whole house to try to find it? We don't do that, do we? Well, the most expensive coin that the U.S. has, probably, at least the ones that we've seen, would be like a silver dollar or something, which I don't know how much that's worth now, but it's not worth too much, more than $1. And you wouldn't spend all day cleaning the whole house trying to find it. My son wanted us to clean the whole house the other day to find his Green Lantern power ring, which was basically a leftover ring from a ring pop that my wife had drawn Sharpie on. It was not terribly valuable, but he wanted us to clean the whole house to try to find it. And we found it, of course, the last place that he had it, in the place I told him to look first. But she turns this house upside down trying to find this coin, and there's a couple of possibilities for why she would do that. One is that the coin was pretty valuable to her. She could have been relatively poor, and that coin symbolized a large part of her wealth. It says she had 10 coins. One of them is 10%. That's a pretty good amount of our money. If we lost that much money, maybe we would clean the house. But another possibility is back then, the dowry that a woman would be given was coins on a string that she would wear. Kind of like we would wear a wedding ring, she would wear kind of a necklace with those coins. And if she lost one of those coins, she sure would flip the house upside down trying to find it. Just like any of the women who look down and suddenly don't see one of the diamonds from a wedding ring. They'd go off and try to find it. And they'd take apart the sink. And back then, this would be harder to do. They didn't have indoor plumbing, so that's not one of the places it would be. But they didn't have very good lights. They had dirt floors. They would have to do some serious cleaning to try to find this coin. Other possibility is the word for coin there is drachma, and that was a coin worth 1 day's pay. So you can think about however much that you make in a day and decide whether you would flip the house upside down trying to find that amount or not, or especially if you were living back then paying roughly 60% of your income in taxes. We thought our tax system was bad, but they were paying some serious taxes because they paid it both to the temple and to Rome. And so she's trying to find this coin, and she also finds it. She calls her friends and neighbors and says, "Rejoice with me, because I found the silver coin that I lost." It wasn't just her celebrating, it was the whole neighborhood celebrating. And it says the reason for that is the same way the angels in heaven rejoice over one who repents. So for the men, he points out that there's one sheep that's lost, and the angels rejoice because this one soul has been found. And one coin is lost, and the angels remind us the angels rejoice because one was lost and is now found. And then he gets really serious. He says a man has 2 sons. And I think even if we hadn't heard this story before, we ought to know where this is going. Somehow one of these sons is going to get lost. And the younger of them said to the father, "Father, give me a share of the estate that I have coming to me." That's not a really good conversation to have with your father. When I've heard ministers preach about this, usually this is the part where they say the father takes off his belt and chases the son out of the house. Something along those lines. But I don't know what he did back then. I don't know how this father reacts. We know eventually he gives the inheritance to the son. Can you imagine how he would have felt if the son is basically saying, I don't really want to have a relationship with you anymore. I just want to have the money. Or even worse than that, I want to take that land that's been in our family all these years and I want to sell it. And that's what he does. Father, give me a share of the estate that I have coming to me. And that's kind of a combination word for all the money, all the property, all the animals and things like that they might have had. So he distributes the assets to them. He goes ahead and he makes sure that everything, I guess, is in the name of both of the sons. He gives the younger son his share and the older son his share. It wasn't an even split back then. The younger son got 1/3 and the older son got 2/3. Well, not many days later, the younger son gathered together all he had and he traveled to a distant country. Now, in order for him to gather up all he had, he would have had to sell everything that the father had given him. And if you're going to go out and sell all that stuff within a couple of days, you didn't get top dollar for it. So the father not only had to figure out how to split this property with the son, he watched his son, I guess, have a little yard sale or auction or something and sell that property. And the whole community would have known what was happening. And if we ever thought that our rumor mills turned quick, it would have turned a whole lot quicker back then. It had been the talk of the town when this son gathers up his coins that he had made and starts walking out of town. After he had spent, not many days later, he gathers up what he had, travels to a distant country where he squanders his estate in foolish living. The King James, I think, says riotous living. And after all of that, we don't have a good record of what he did with the money, but he wastes it all. Whatever he was given, he just plain wastes it on stuff that doesn't matter, stuff that's not important. And after he had spent everything, it says verse 14, a severe famine struck that country, and he had nothing. So the last bit of anything he had was gone. He goes to work for one of the citizens of that country who sent him into his field to feed pigs. So you can imagine this man. We don't know how old he is, but he's all of a sudden now working with pigs, which would be bad enough on its own, but if I think we can safely assume that the crowd would imagine him as a Jewish man. Now he's working with unclean animals. And not only working with the unclean animals, but it says he's longing to eat even the pods that the pigs were eating. Any of you guys ever worked on a farm? Have you ever wanted to eat any of the chicken feed or the pig slop? No. You got to be pretty hungry to get to that point, but that's where he was. That's how desperate that he was. He was that hungry that he longed to eat what the pigs were eating. And so he comes to his senses in verse 17, and he starts to think to himself, boy, my father's servants, they've got it pretty good back home. Well, maybe if I go back home, I can work there. And he says, I'll get up and go to my father. And he has this little speech planned for himself. He says, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your workers. Have you ever been in that spot, kind of far away in a broken relationship, and you're trying to figure out exactly what to say to make things right? Jacob went through that struggle when he was trying to figure out reconciling with Esau. Kind of going through this speech in your head and planning out what you're going to say when you see that person again. And so that's what this man's doing. But in verse 20, he gets up. This is after, we don't know exactly how long he was gone. But we know that the father, while he was still far off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and threw his arms around him and kissed him. And the son starts his speech, and the father interrupts him. Wouldn't even let him finish the speech to try to be like one of the servants. And the father, he welcomes him. He throws a party. He invites the neighbors to celebrate that the son that he had lost was now found. And at this point, when everybody should be excited and everybody should be celebrating, there's one person who's not celebrating. That older son, he starts to feel a little bit maybe jealous, I guess, hurt. He sees the father put the best robe, the best sandals, the ring, and kill the fatted calf to have this celebration. Now, who owned all that stuff? Who owned the fatted calf and the robe and the ring? Verse 12, the end of verse 12. So he distributed the assets to them. At this point, I think the older brother feels like he owns everything. The younger brother got his part, older brother knows what his part is. And then when the younger brother comes home, the father takes the robe and the ring and the fatted calf. And the older brother becomes angry, it says. He didn't want to go in. And he is upset. And he has his own little speech planned. And I wonder, it doesn't say, but I wonder how many times he's thought about what he was going to say to his father. Because it doesn't sound like this is very spur of the moment to me. Verse 29. I've been slaving many years for you, and I've never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me a goat, even a goat, so that I could celebrate with my friends. So he's been holding this grudge against his father for apparently a lot of years, wishing that he could have even celebrated with his friends. What was lost is now found, but what was found is now lost. This older brother does not have the relationship that he should have with the father. He is just as far away from the father now as the younger brother was. Verse 31, Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and is now alive. He was lost, but now he's found. We have this celebration because the one who was lost is now found. One of the professors over at Milligan had a sermon about this passage, probably what kind of got my interest in it in the first place. It was titled Prodigal God. There's also a book by that title. But the basic gist of it is the word prodigal means wastefully extravagant. And that's what this young man did. He wasted all of his money, all of his property, wasted this relationship that he had all of these years. But then when he came home, the father did even more than he could ask or imagine. Something that we would consider wasteful, something the world would not really understand. But he welcomed him back. He even ran to him. And that was not something that a proper older man ever did in that culture. It was just not considered polite. But he didn't care. He didn't care what other people thought when he ran to welcome his son back. He didn't care what his son had been doing. He didn't care any of that. He welcomed him back. And I would say, in the mind of the father, everything he spent on that robe and that ring and that fatted calf, it was all worth it. Every bit of effort it took to throw that celebration, it was all worth it. But then I would wonder, to that older brother, was it worth it? Walking out of the celebration or not going in the first place? Losing that relationship with the father? Feeling this jealousy, not being reunited with his brother? Was it worth it? We don't have an answer. some of these stories that Jesus tells us, we're kind of left at the end of it wondering, what would I do in that situation? Who am I in this story? And I think for each of us, we can kind of fit ourselves into a little bit of a different spot. Sometimes we feel like one of the 99 sheep who is doing just fine, not really struggling too much. Sometimes we feel like the one sheep that has wandered itself away, who's gotten lost, detached from the group, from the church, from the family. Or maybe sometimes we feel like we've just gotten ourselves all in a pile of dirt somewhere in the corner, just waiting to be found. Or in the third story, we might feel like the younger son who wandered away. One of my favorite hymns, I was sinking deep in sin, far from the faithful shore, very deeply stained within, sinking to rise no more. Maybe we're feeling that way. We're far away from God. We're separated from our family or from the church family, wandering away into whatever kind of living. Eventually feeling that desperation and hoping to come back home, hitting that rock bottom. Or maybe we feel like the younger brother, like we've put in all this work for all these years, wondering if it's worth it and feeling like it's not. Wondering why we served or sacrificed, or it says slaved for many years. That's how the older son felt. He didn't feel like a son, he felt like a slave. But the father is there to reassure him that there is a relationship. Everything I have is yours. Celebrate, rejoice with us. But sometimes the older brother just doesn't want to participate, doesn't want to celebrate, doesn't feel like welcoming the dirty younger brother who finally comes home. Sometimes we as church people can have a tough time when someone comes to faith. Usually we'll celebrate. A lot of times we will. But if we hear about someone who's really been living in sin, sometimes it's hard for us to accept. Sometimes it's hard to welcome. Sometimes maybe we feel like whatever they've done is going to rub off on us. But I don't think we have to worry about that. I think we should welcome and we should celebrate, it says, just like the angels in heaven. I wish I could remember the name of the song, but at the first church I ever preached at, we're preaching on this passage, and we sang a song, one of the contemporary songs, where the music video is just pure celebration of someone who had finally come home, finally come to faith, and was celebrating this welcome home. And there was this powerful moment of singing together this song that a lot of us had heard on the radio, but had never sung in church. And we were excited. And I knew, and the whole congregation didn't know, but we had a special sermon planned that day. As the younger son, I stepped up and I talked about what it was like for me making this decision and taking the inheritance, and I walked out the back door of the church and everybody was kind of looking around confused. And one of our deacons, who was an actor at the local theater, he stands up and he starts a monologue as the older brother. And then one of our elders stepped up, and he was the father who was trying to welcome the younger brother home. And when he was done, I came back. And again, as the younger brother, talked about what it was like to be welcomed home, to celebrate, to have a new relationship. And I thought it was a powerful moment for us all to remember what that was like. The time when we were far from God, when we were the ones sinking, when we were the ones celebrating, or separated from God. And God welcomes us back, and we can all celebrate the welcome home. So, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, the big theme for me this spring, was it worth it? Was all that effort of the shepherd worth it? Was the effort of the woman worth bringing the coin back where it should be? Was the younger son's riotous living worth it? The older son wandering away from the party? All of the father's extravagance. We probably should mention how valuable these things are. But I think we know. I think we know how important it is, not just for the son to get a ring and a robe and a fatted calf and a little party, but a restored relationship with the Father is worth more than all of those things. And at this point in each of our services, there's a chance for someone to come back to Christ who has been far away. Someone to come to Him for the first time. For all of us to celebrate when that happens. And I would encourage each of you, if you feel far from God, now is the time to come forward and to pray. And for us to all celebrate with you this chance to come home. Or if it's a first-time decision, something that you've been putting off, there's no better time than now. And the Father will run out and will greet you. And the angels in heaven will rejoice. Let's pray, and then we'll sing the closing hymn. Let's see which one it was. I have decided to follow Jesus. Let us pray.